geht's mit dem Programm hier auf unserer Markplatzbühne und ich freue mich besonders, denn wir haben jetzt ein richtiges Programm-Highlight und für dieses Programm-Highlight schalten wir sogar nach Australien zu einem Mann, der auf LinkedIn eine wirklich bekannte Persönlichkeit ist mit über 100.000 Followern und da teilt er seine Perspektiven und Einschätzungen zum Thema Mobilität, was er heute auch live aus Australien mit uns machen wird. Sein Vortrag wird auf Englisch sein. Wir haben im Nachgang noch eine kleine Q&A, also solltet ihr Fragen haben, dann gerne jederzeit im Nachgang. Ich werde dann wieder hier auf der Bühne unterstützen. But now I'm switching to English to welcome our guest and please give him a huge applause to Brömmelstroet. Marco, are you already with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So we welcome you here on our stage digitally, and we are really looking forward that you are going to tell us why John Lennon was in bed actually with a bicycle. We cannot wait. So please go ahead, and I will join you afterwards for some Q&A session.
Thanks. Thanks for introducing me, and thanks for having me. Well, the first statement for me is in German. Wir brauchen keine Mobilitätswende. Was wir brauchen ist eine Gesellschaftswende. And that's what I want to talk with you about. We do not need a mobility change. We need a radical change of society. And therefore, it is realized why John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in bed with his bicycle. In 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono visited Amsterdam on their honeymoon. And you can see them here. They did a bed-in, a sleep-in for 7 days. They stayed in the Hilton Hotel. And celebrated their honeymoon, protesting for world peace by staying in bed. So what happened was that many people actually visited them in their honeymoon suite and brought them gifts. And one of the gifts you can see on this image here is an iconic white, Dutch, old, rickety, broken down, single speed, sitting upright bicycle. So why were they in bed with a bicycle? That's the key question that I want to tell you a story about and to share with you, because I think it's vital to understand if we also think that we want to work on a Gesellschaftswende or a mobility change. One important element here is that when they were in bed here, Yoko Ono was already thinking about a song, and that song would be published 3 years later. And you might recognize the song. It goes a little bit like this. So we know the song as Imagine, and Imagine was written in this very bed with the bicycle in it, and this will come back later. So why is this so important? Well, I'm going to share with you a few steps in my story, and the first steps are quite philosophical, but of course I will end up with very practical advice and maybe teach you a trick along the way. And if everything goes well, I might even sing a song. So let's start with the philosophy, because the key point that I want to make with you today, and I hope you will remember, is this very statement. The statement that language is not a mirror of reality. The language we speak is not an objective way to describe reality. The language we speak shapes what we see, what we do not see, and what kind of problems we solve. So the language we use in the end shapes reality. It defines how we are going to act and change the future, in this case, of the mobility system. So this is a very vital quote in my story, because it basically shares both the problem and the solution, if we want to raise in the language. So I will explain in a few steps what language does. Language simplifies reality, step one. In the simplification, it makes choices, arbitrary choices, that's step two. And those choices become performative, that's step three. So don't worry, I will take you through each of these 3 steps. And normally, now I would ask you a question, and the question has to do with the image that you see in front of you. So you can just join me in the thought experiment. If I show this picture to somebody who is blind, I always ask the audience to help me write a short sentence to describe what we are seeing. And there are many ways to do that. So people in general start shouting. I don't know, maybe you're shouting now as well. shouting all kinds of ways to simplify this reality. And what you're doing, if I ask you to describe this reality, is you're simplifying it. So we need language to simplify complex reality. And some people might see here a deer that is crossing the road, and that's a valid simplification of reality. Other people might see a road crossing the forest, and that is also a valid simplification of reality. But we need language, and we need to make those choices. And the point here is that there's not a good or a bad choice in simplifying reality. We have to do it. We have to simplify reality. And in doing that, we make choices. And these choices matter. These choices are, in a way, always arbitrary. You can always discuss them. But the choices are very vital to understand because they matter. They define what we see, what we do not see, what problems we identify, and what solutions we are offering. And this is of vital importance, especially if there are people in the room who are actively working to create a future, who are actively working to create, for instance, a transit system of the future. We need to be reflexive on the language that we use because we are shaping reality. And I will give you a final example in this philosophical section of how this third step works. So we have simplification of reality, we make arbitrary choices, and then these choices start to shape reality. And the best example I know from this is from the book Seeing Like a State, written by James Scott in 1998, writes with the example of the forest about how states also need to simplify. If you need to govern something, you need to simplify it into indicators or models or guidelines. And with these indicators, you then make certain decisions. And how that shapes reality is best explained here with what he calls the primeval forest. So the primeval forest on the left here is a complex ecosystem, and it doesn't belong to anybody. There's nobody in control of this ecosystem. It just grew over time. And because it's so complex, it serves multiple different goals. In this forest, a rabbit can easily hide, a fox can easily hunt, birds can easily nest, small animals can play and live. And because of that, this forest is a very rich ecosystem with a wide variety of animals and plants. But this changed over time. And it changed, according to James Scott, at the end of the 18th century. Because at that time, a new question was asked to the forest. Because societies needed wood. And if you need wood, you want to govern your forest for optimal wood production, right? So to do that, they actually invented a whole new academic domain, which didn't exist before. And today we know it as scientific forestry. And scientific forestry had to come up with a new language, a new simplification of the forest that could help us to see how we can optimize it for wood production. So a new language, choices were made, and those choices started to actually change reality. One of the key choices, one of the key elements of that language, which was used as a central indicator to think about forest, was the standard tree, or actually it were German scientists, and the German scientists called this the Normalbaum. So the standard tree was sort of an ideal typical tree for wood production, and that tree was used, or that concept basically was used to govern forest, and that changed the forest forever. Because what happened was that we created, with this standard tree, we created production forests. So we moved from the primeval forest to the production forest, following the simplification of the standard tree. So what you see here, and you can see that in the Harz or Sauerland or wherever you go in Germany or Europe, you see rows and rows of trees. All trees from the same age, planted in such a way that they can be easily planted, easily maintained, and easily harvested.
Marco, I'm really, really sorry to interrupt. I'm sure you cannot see me, but I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, we're not able to show your presentation any longer. We can hear you perfectly, but we cannot see your presentation. So in case you refer to the presentation, we kindly ask you to also describe what could be seen, okay? I'm really afraid to say that.
But should I reload the presentation?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with your presentation. The presentation is just perfect. It's just some technical issues from our side.
Okay. Yeah, I see that the sharing is stopped.
But now we can see at least your picture. That's also good.
Okay. It's a bit harder, but I will try. So if you have solved it, maybe, then let me know. I can reshare my slides. So what did you see? Did you see the forest?
We did.
Yeah. Okay. So simplifying simplifying the primeval forest through the logic of wood production led to the production forest, and the production forest is the simplified version of a forest. And an important element that I want to highlight is what happened in that forest is that all the other goals of the forest disappeared. So over time, we created a forest optimal for wood production, but actually all the small animals could no longer hide there. Try to do hide and seek in a production forest. It's impossible. So also other animals couldn't hunt. Birds could not build a nest. So what you see that in these forests, many of these smaller species especially have disappeared over time, leading to a large ecological crisis. So that brings me to the basic end of the philosophical part, right? Language simplifies reality, and through this simplification, we make choices, and with these choices, we then actually shape, in this case, our forest. But the exact same thing happened in shaping our streets. So when we were thinking about the mobility system, at first, we have to start with the street. And the street was also a primeval street. Until 1920, nobody owned the street. Nobody governed it. We didn't have any traffic engineers. They didn't exist. Until that time, streets, many different goals were served. And I have this beautiful image of Mulberry Street in the 1920s in New York, where you can see that many people use the street for many different purposes. Small children even use it to play. Adults use it to trade, to sell and buy stuff, and to meet each other. So the street was known until that time as the remaining space between buildings. It didn't belong to anybody, and therefore it served multiple different goals. But that changed in the 1920s, 100 years ago, not because we needed wood, but because suddenly there was a new innovation coming to that street, which was the mass motorization. So suddenly many big and fast motor vehicles were entering this complex ecosystem of our streets and literally caused huge amounts of suffering. Especially young children were dying in large numbers in the 1920s, as written down by Peter Norton in Fighting Traffic. And at first, the language that we used to address this was the language that we now know as the language of justice. And it was seen as completely unjust that children were dying because this mass motorization was happening. But, and this is both painful but also hopeful, in only 10 years' time, between 1920 and 1930, a whole new language was invented. And that language shifted the conversation from justice to efficiency, control, and the freedom of the individual car driver. That language we know today as traffic engineering, because just as scientific forestry, traffic engineering had to be invented. It was a language that did not exist, but was especially needed from the perspective of the car industry. And that language, and that's a key point for us today, that language solidified. So choices were made in the 1930s to think about our street and our mobility system in a certain way. And those choices are no longer questioned because they became solidified. These choices solidified into norms, into guidelines on how to think about streets. These choices solidified into traffic models, into institutions, into ministries. They solidified into laws on how to behave on a street and who has right of way. And they solidified into concrete, steel, and asphalt. So if we look outside, if you're going to leave the venue today, you will enter the street, and it's a solidified version of the choices we made in the 1930s. So let's unpack a few of those choices. What are actually the choices that guide our thinking of streets? Basically, it leads back to Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier's idea, a key principle, was the death to the street. He also was thinking about the primeval city and making it a more productive city in the 1940s and 50s, 60s. He worked on these concepts, and one of the key concepts was the death of the street. He wanted the streets to serve as places where people could go as fast as possible from A to B. Traveling, according to him, was a derived demand. You actually wanted to be effective at A or at B, and everything in between had to serve that specific goal. His mantra was optimize the machine, marginalize the human, right? So we marginalize human behavior to optimize the machine. So what is then the machine? Well, as I already told you, traffic engineering was invented in the 1930s. So I can ask you now the question, because I can see you sitting, but probably not hear you. But who do you think would be the first traffic engineers? Who do you go to in the 1930s to ask if they could write the first books about traffic engineering? Who do you ask to invent the language we will use for decades to shape our mobility system? And I'm not getting your answers, but looking at your faces, you are now puzzled. And the answer to the puzzle, again, comes from Peter Norton. Who did we ask? We asked water engineers. So at first, we asked water engineers because they solved big problems. They solved the sewage problem in cities. They solved water problems in cities. So we asked them as society, can you please also come up with a way of thinking about our streets with this problem of all the children dying and to use them more efficiently as places to go from A to B. So this is why, until this day, we see our streets as pipelines. And I don't know who of you ever has seen the movie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So you can shake if you've seen Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So I always wondered, why can these creatures live in a sewage system? But that's obvious, right? Because a water engineer makes the sewage system as big as the maximum intensity that is required. So the rest of the year, the sewage system is empty for this one moment where it needs to sort of flow all this sewage out of the city without blockage. And that's exactly how we still think about our streets. Our streets are pipelines that have been designed for peak capacity. Look around you if you walk out today. It's a pipeline system. And we use all kinds of language still, like flow. It's also directly taken from this idea of the pipeline system. And because of this, we feel that the pipeline should never be clogged, because that's a big problem, right? It should never be clogged. It should always flow. So then a second line of thinking entered, and it came from biology. In the 1930s, biological thinking made progress in understanding the human body. So traffic engineers that were writing books started to borrow language from biology. You know it, right? You go to the heart of the city, and streets are arteries, maybe. And what should never happen with arteries in your body? They should never be clogged. So it fits. So we come up again with all kinds of words, like if that happens, in Dutch, we will call it a traffic infarct, maybe also in German, a Verkehrsinfarkt. It just comes from the human body, and it sounds like something is dying, but it isn't. But it's a metaphor. It's a language that we use to think about it. And if there is a Verkehrsinfarkt, what do we build? We build a bypass, right? Just as the doctor would do. And again, this problem of congestion, it comes from our bellies. The idea that there is something wrong with congestion, that everything should always flow. And these two things combined lead to one central principle, meaning that our streets should never be clogged. They should always have free flow. And that's where we spend all our money. No, even worse. Every half an hour on every radio station until today, everybody will hear that there is congestion somewhere. That's 360 minutes every week, 6 hours of radio time per radio station to discuss the fact that there are some people waiting. And two more elements I want to discuss, because they lead also to this almost the same conclusion. The two more tropes, you could say. One was the idea, the language that was taken from physics. And the idea is, I don't know if there's traffic engineers in the room, but the idea was that cities are like gravitational models. That's literally the four-step transport model that we still use to this day to make decisions, simplifies the city as physical bodies in space. So the idea is if you bring them closer together, they have more interaction potential, and that's good for the economy. And bringing things closer together means reducing travel time, okay? So travel time savings have become the holy grail of all political parties from the left to the right on the political spectrum, because bringing things closer together is the holy grail of economic growth. And that relates to a fourth and final element, because we found out that the water engineers, they found out that humans are not like water drops. Humans are very complex. They make their own decisions. So we had to find a simplification of human behavior. And that's what we found in economics. In economics, we had this beautiful model, which is called the Homo economicus, which means that all of you, like literally every single one of you, is an egoistic, isolated, cold, and calculating individual who optimizes his or her own utility, very egoistically, right? That's who you are. That's what the Homo economicus suggests, and that's what's in all transportation models. You are picking the mode and you're looking for the route that gives you the most utility. And remember, as Le Corbusier already told us, being underway is a disutility. It's a negative utility. So you want to spend as little time as possible underway. Ideally, you would just go from Adelaide to Berlin, like today. So these two things together add to this idea of travel time savings not being questioned, right? This is the key goal. We need travel time savings. If you look in the cost-benefit analysis of your city or your government, you will find that travel time savings are the key guiding principle that will guide projects, that will make decisions on certain mobility projects over others. So this language, these choices are solidified into models. They are solidified into rules, into decisions. We spend in the Netherlands alone about 8 billion euros a year chasing travel time savings. So to wrap up this part, I hope you still remember that we moved from the primeval forest to the production forest with the language of wood production and the Normalbaum. So similarly, and I have this beautiful image here, you have to believe me, we moved from the primeval street, Mulberry Street, to the production street. And you can look it up, but Mulberry Street today has no children playing, it has no trade, it has no people meeting each other. It's just a sewage system, an efficient, effective machinery to push people from A to B, optimize the machine, marginalize the human. And now we are stuck. I'm sorry to say, but we're stuck. Because if you look around many of these venues, you will have the smart and rich people of the world presenting solutions to our mobility problems. But they are stuck in the same language. They still present us self-driving cars as ways to solve congestion and to make travel time savings 100%. Because now you're underway. And look at all these images of people. I have this image here of Mercedes-Benz, where all the people are sitting in the self-driving vehicle with the VR glasses on. It's beautiful, right? You no longer have travel time. You can do whatever you want, like check your emails or watch Netflix, but you have no travel time. You have no conflict with all the other egoistic individuals that are cold and calculating. Great, right? And then you have these smart future cities that look like optimal machines. You never see humans in them. Humans are pesky. We put them in tunnels. Or you know what? We put them in a pipeline system. You know how we call it? We call it the Hyperloop. And the Hyperloop is this efficient, ideal pipeline that will shoot you to Paris. Of course, you cannot see out of the window because there are no windows and you might be very nauseous, but at least you will have travel time savings. That's great, right? So now you can have a coffee in Paris. And that brings us back to the question in the beginning. Because many people think that somehow in the Netherlands, there was this magic connected to the bicycle, right? John Lennon in bed with a bicycle, because the bicycle cannot fit in this logic. So it's sort of, we all feel it. The bicycle, this sitting upright, crazy Dutch people, somehow they seem to not fit in this logic. So they might offer us a glimpse into a different future. But again, I have this image here that you cannot see, but I can promise you that the Dutch cycling industry is presenting now the bicycle as another mobility fix, as a system of bicycle highways, super bicycle highways, super cycle, super hyper bicycle highways, with speed pedelecs and faster e-bikes, with smart helmets, with connected traffic lights and everything. Now cycling can also become utilitarian. It can become an easy way to go to your job. So brings back the question, right? Is this why John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in bed with a bicycle? Was this why they were in bed with a bicycle? Because they thought that cycling was the mobility fix? Because if that's true, then this was probably their song. And you have to tell me if you think this is true at the end, okay? So imagine all car drivers using pedelecs and e-bikes to move more efficiently. Smart bikes and smart helmets to optimize the machine. Ooh. I don't know what the neighbors in the other hotel room think that I'm doing now, but I don't think that this was the song that they were thinking about. So that brings us to a very important element. Why were they in bed with a bicycle? And why is it so problematic that we are not understanding the key question or the answer to that question? And that has to do with the fact that, yes, all simplifications of reality make choices, but the choice we made here is wrong. And we should go back to the forest to understand that. If I ask you the question, which forest is more productive in terms of wood production, I think many would think that this is the production forest, but it isn't. The oversimplification that we used to design the production forests make them very vulnerable. And actually, the primeval forests are much more productive in the longer run to produce wood. And the same thing happened on our streets. There are no travel time savings. We know empirically for a fact that people travel the same amount of travel time like they did 50 years ago in the Netherlands. But they now also travel 6 times as far. So instead of 7 kilometers per day, the average Dutch person, we are not making bodies coming closer together. There is no gravitational pull. There's a centrifugal force. We are moving further and further and further apart. The activities go further and further apart, and we become mobility dependent. Our streets have become pipeline systems and sewages, but they are not solving the original problem of making activities more accessible. So here another key quote comes. If a factory is torn down, but the that produced it standing, it will simply produce another factory. If we think we need radical change, if you follow me in my statement that we brauchen keine Mobilitätswende, wir brauchen eine Gesellschaftswende, we need a radical mobility change, you need to question the underlying language, because otherwise nothing radical will happen. You will just keep on reproducing the same problematic language, the same problematic choices, but now you're just replacing one mode with another. And the beauty here is, and this you can find, it's a great lecture on YouTube by Professor Lara Boroditsky. It's called How Language Shapes the Way We Think. And she explains how this works. We are a beautiful set of creatures, because the one thing that we can do, all of you in the room here today, you can reinvent language. Languages are living things. There are 7,000 languages spoken around the world, 7,000. So we can hone and change them to suit our needs. Because the linguistic choices that we make, that you make individually, shape your thoughts. So this gives you the power to think, what kind of thoughts do I want to have? What kind of futures do I want to think about? Why am I in this business of public transport? What actually drives me? What do I want to think about? Is it bringing people faster and more efficiently from A to B? Or is it something else? You can do that. You can just do it. It's magic, but you can. And this is why John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in bed with a bicycle. They were in bed with a bicycle because in the 70s and late 60s, the bicycle represented a radical change to think about society. Gesellschaftswende. It was capitalism. And he actually was a big Aston Martin lover. And they arrived at the Hilton Hotel in a big room. It was the counter movement that Yoko Ono found very interesting in Amsterdam. It was the counter movement that brought the bicycle. The white painted bicycle represented the idea of an end to ownership, and the idea that cycling could give us the freedom to think not only about streets as places to move through and travel time as a disutility, but actually streets as a quality, a place where people meet each other and meeting each other in a very, very special way. And that brings us to Amsterdam. And again, I'm sorry that I can't show you these clips. Typical clips from Amsterdam. And these notions of all these cyclists that are sort of having conflicts with each other, and a traffic engineer coming there and saying, hey, you need to solve this. I have traffic lights. I can solve all these conflicts between all these people. But the sociologist would say, wait a minute, there are actually people underway in public space actively being exposed to each other. Sociologists call this the potential exposure to diversity, a very different language to understand the same reality, but leading to very, very different conclusions. Because these people are not only exposed to each other, they actively negotiate. They're not homo economicus, they're not egoists, because you cannot negotiate as an egoist. They are mostly altruistic. They use cues from each other. They send with all their senses. This is, by the way, why Dutch people ride upright and have a back pedal brake, which is both crazy, but it helps because it can help you to send and receive signals and to dance with each other. So you're dancing. You're not only exposed to the other, you're not in conflict. Together, you're shaping mobility and you're exposed to diversity. And now the beauty is, if you look into what does this do? Potential exposure to diversity, a new language, a new indicator, links positively to the feeling of membership, the feeling of influence, the sense of integration, a higher fulfillment of needs, more shared emotional connections, a higher sense of neighboring, collective efficacy, citizen participation, sense of community, sense of belonging, sense of place, and the most, if you meet each other, become different. By all these exposures to people that are different from you, you develop trust. Your prejudices get lower, and you develop an understanding that you're all in the same society. Can you imagine spending our mobility budget? Can you imagine selling public transport as a place that leads to these kinds of awesome indicators? Wow. Instead of marginalizing the human to optimize the machine, we can actually minimize the machine and let humanity thrive. That might be actually what we want to do. We're looking for. And fear not, because you can do it. You are actually very good at that, but you need to unleash it. The only thing that's holding you back is your attachment to a conceptual framework that you have been taught, either at school or as society, or the fact that every half an hour on every radio station we hear congestion as a problem. But that's the only thing holding you back. You can walk out of this meeting and you can decide for yourself to change the language you use to shape the thoughts that you have. Because the language you use is not a mirror of reality. The language you use profoundly shapes what you see, what you do not see, what people around you see and do not see, and which actions you together will undertake. Real radical change will only happen if we challenge the narratives, the narrative of efficiency and speed. And again, we have the power to do that. We can just do it. We can develop new mobility narratives. Maybe mobility narratives that not see being underway as a quantity to be reduced, but as a quality to be increased. I want a small anecdote. I was in a sleeping train from after the movie that you saw. Maybe I was in a sleeping train from Munich to Amsterdam, and we had a 2-hour delay. And I told my children that we had 2 hours of free time, additional to the time that we already booked. So being on the way can be a quality to be increased. Maybe we shouldn't see the street as a place to optimize the machine. Maybe you now choose to make it in place where you want to let humanity thrive. Maybe not see it, but a necessary and insufficient means to a different city and a different society. This This is our choice. You cannot not make a choice. You are using language one way or the other. This is our choice. No, this is your choice. And the only thing I can do is wish you all the best with it. So thanks for listening, and I hope it was clear even without the slides. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Marco, I hope you can hear me too. Thank you so much, and I hope you also heard the applause that was dedicated to you. Perfect.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation and your flexibility. Well, what shall I say? Germany is not known for always having the best internet connection. I have to admit that. We are all aware of that. But at least we could hear you okay. But sorry for not being able to show your slides. But we heard your singing, and that was fantastic. And it also deserves another applause. Please give it a big applause for his singing. I hope we haven't lost the connection yet, and we still are connected to Marco. Marco, can you say something?
Yeah. I can see you and hear you.
Okay, it's a pity. What shall I say? German internet connection. Well, but what I definitely would like to take the opportunity to ask our audience if we have any questions. So please raise your hand if you have any question that you would like to ask Marco. Now we still have the opportunity. Anyone has a question? Yes, we do have a question. You will get a microphone in a second.
Yes, hi, Marco, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So due to the connection issues, it was sometimes very hard to follow you 100%. But anyways, thank you so much for the very interesting thoughts on radical change here. Could you go deeper, or could you repeat maybe the practical step we all can do, like to fulfill or to go the first steps in that radical change?
Sure. Easy.
Thank you.
First, buy the book, Movement. It will be published in German next year. No kidding. I think, well, the lesson that I hope to give to you is that the only way that let's assume that you want to be radical. You want to be radical?
Yes.
Yeah. So the only way that you can be radical is that you change your thoughts. So you, every time, I would say, that's a very practical every time that you're in mobility, every time that you're reading the newspaper, question the words that are chosen and how they are framing your thinking. So that's step one, right? To become aware of the matrix. It's all around us. Like the language that is used frames the things that we see. So already being aware that it's crazy that we use the word congestion or Verkehrsüberlastung. So that's step one. And become the annoying person that shows this to other people all the time and say, hey, you're using these words. Why do you say that the street is closed, for instance? Why is it not opened? Why is our thinking so limited? And then step two, what you can do, and you're very good at that, is developing new language, new narratives, new important goals. And I used as an example exposure to diversity, but let's make it simpler. What I really like is to use narratives that nobody can disagree with, and that solve dilemmas that we currently are not solving. And one very clear example of this is children. So the biggest loss of society in the last decades because of this system has been for our children. They have lost the right to roam. They've lost the right to be autonomous. They basically lost the right to be relaxed in public space. So if we want to challenge the narrative of efficiency and speed, the narrative of comfort, the first thing to do is to change the conversation into, but what about the children? In the city where I live in the Netherlands, we now finally got a motion accepted that states that it should be the norm for our city that 8-year-old children should be able to go to school by themselves. And that's just the starting point of a fully new narrative, right? Because it challenges everything that we do. And it shifts the debate, because who's against that? Traffic engineers cannot put that in their models. So that's one. And then a final thought, be aware that the current narrative can only sustain itself because we as society cover its costs. The fact that speed and efficiency and that people depend on it, and the fact that people defend the status quo, you should challenge them by showing that at least 40% of the costs of owning and driving a car are paid for by society at large. So this narrative, by definition, will not sustain. It is not sustainable. It cannot run because it depletes the environment, it depletes resources, it depletes government funds, it depletes human, and those costs have been running up in the last decade. So that's the second step that you can do. Always question the fact that the current status quo is not a given. It has been created in the last decades, and it's costing us much more than the gains that we have. So I hope that's enough.
Yes, definitely. And I think
Thank
it
you.
also became clear with the example that you mentioned during your presentation that we can also reframe like waiting times. I think that was the very well chosen example for your statement. So what I have to say is, buy your book, follow you on LinkedIn. Thank you so much, Marco, for sharing your insights, your perspective. It was a pleasure having you with us digitally today.
Sure. Likewise. Thanks for having me, and have a good conference, and change your language from today on.
Thank you.